There were 2 more murders 15 miles away.
When police arrived, they found the telephones and electricity lines.
We have a weird homicide.
In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird...
Morning.
Cup of murder.
One case can create an unexpected domino effect. On November 17, 2017, a man was sentenced for crimes that, had he not been connected to one specific case, might have never been solved. So if you like your coffee hot but your bones chilled, sit back and start your day with a morning cup of murder. On July 31st, 2003, a woman contacted Connecticut police to tell them that it had been 7 days since she heard from her sister, Nilsa Arizmendi. Immediately after opening a case into the 33-year-old's whereabouts, police pointed to her boyfriend as a potential suspect in the disappearance. He was a known and convicted drug dealer, but when given the polygraph test, he passed without issue and was cleared as a suspect. According to the sister, Nilsa was a heroin user and sex worker who was living in a motel in Wethersfield with her boyfriend. And according to the boyfriend, she allowed a man named William Devin Howell to stay overnight in their room, and he last saw her getting into this man's van on July 25, 2003 at 2:30 in the morning. According to his claims, Nilsa, the boyfriend, and William, who they knew as Devin, smoked crack together, and when she got into his van that day, it was to go get some more drugs. Describing the van to investigators, they were able to trace it back to William Howell and track it down for searching. Inside, they found a back cushion stained with blood, so much so that it soaked through the fabric and into the foam underneath, as well as a separate cushion that had been obviously replaced. There were also 6 videotapes of William having, quote, bizarre sex with various women, but filmed in such a way that it obscured their faces and prevented identification. The blood was later traced to Nilsa Arizmendi and another unidentified individual, but unfortunately, without a body, the prosecutors didn't have enough evidence to prove that a murder actually took place. This allowed William to agree to a lesser charge of manslaughter. He entered an Alford plea and, at his sentencing, insisted that he did not kill Nilsa Arizmendi and that the blood, though hers, came from a fight that she had with her boyfriend. He later tried to get this plea thrown out, claiming he only entered it because his lawyers pressured him. William was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He would later tell author Anne K. Howard that Nilsa wanted a ride to Hartford, but instead, he grabbed her, raped her throughout the night and into the next day, killed her, and then threw her down a hill into what he called his garden. What the Arizmendi family and even the police didn't know at the time was that Nilsa was unfortunately not William Howell's first nor his last victim. But though a total of 7 women, including Nilsa, disappeared after interactions with this dangerous man, their cases were either unsolved or unknown until he became a suspect in Nilsa Arizmendi's case. The first known victim of this serial killer, one of the most prolific in Connecticut history, was a woman named Melanie Ruth Camellini. Melanie, just 29 years old and a mother of 2, went missing on January 1st, 2003, and was last seen in the company of 2 men. Because she had substance abuse problems and was known to disappear for long periods of time, her case wasn't known until much later. Then, on June 18, 2003, a woman named Janice Roberts was last seen getting into William's blue van outside a Stop and Shop in Wethersfield. The 44-year-old woman was reported missing on the 24th, and according to what William later told an informant, he tried to engage Janice in a sexual act, and when he realized that she was transgender, he strangled her to death. In mid-2003, Diane Cusack, a 55-year-old New Britain resident, disappeared. Police last had contact with her on July 9th after a landlord-tenant dispute. Though her remains were found in 2007, she wasn't identified until 2011. She, like some of the other victims, had a substance abuse problem and had been out of contact with her family for years, which is why she was never reported missing. Next came the murder of Nilsa Arizmendi, and the start of an investigation into William Devin Howell. However, before he was placed behind bars, he managed to get a few more victims under his belt. There was Marilyn Gonzalez, a 26-year-old mother of two who went missing sometime in 2003 after leaving her home in Waterbury. 23-year-old Joveline Joe Martinez, who went missing on October 10, 2003, but was not reported missing until March 29, 2004, after she failed to show up at her own birthday party. And Mary Jane Menard, a 40-year-old mother of two and former addict who turned her life around and became a substance abuse counselor. She went missing from New Britain in October of 2003. All 7 women disappeared in 2003, and their cases remained unknown and unsolved until William became a suspect in Nielsa's murder. And just weeks after his sentencing, a hunter stumbled upon his, quote, garden and found human remains. Just behind the West Farm Shopping Mall in West Hartford, the remains of Diane Cusack, Joy Martinez, and Mary Jane Menard were found and identified. Then on April 28, 2015, further searching found remains belonging to Nilsa Arizmendi, Marilyn Gonzalez, Melanie Ruth Camellini, and Janice Roberts. William would later tell his cellmate that there was a monster living inside of him, who he described as a, quote, sick ripper. He said that he kept one of the victims' bodies in his van for 2 weeks because it was too cold outside to bury her, and he described how he slept next to her body and called her baby. He later cut the tips of her fingers off, dismantled her bottom jaw, and disposed of her body parts in 2 locations. He later refuted the claim. He said that Melanie Camellini was raped, strangled, and hit in the head with a hammer, and that Marilyn Gonzalez was abducted and raped throughout the night before he took her to go get what would be her final meal at a local McDonald's, driving with her naked body in the back of his van through the drive-thru, and that this bizarre event became a ritual with the rest of his victims. He said that he only killed these women to conceal evidence, stating, quote, I knew that once I raped them, they would go to the cops and I'd end up back in jail, so I had to keep that from happening. I definitely didn't enjoy killing them. As I choked them out, I was thinking, just hurry up and die. On September 18, 2015, William Devin Howell was formally charged with the murder of 3 women, whose identities at the time were kept confidential because they were the victims of sexual assault. Eventually, he would receive a total of 6 counts of murder, and while still serving his 15-year sentence for the manslaughter of Nilsa Arizmendi, received 6 consecutive life sentences that totaled 360 years on November 17, 2017. During his sentencing, he cried and apologized to the families of his victims, calling his actions monstrous, cowardly, and selfish. He stated that, though it had been abolished in 2015, he deserved the death penalty. Thank you for joining me in my morning cup of murder. Please join me again tomorrow to hear a terrible thing happened on November 18th. Don't forget to rate and subscribe and let me know how you like it. If you want to help support the podcast, there's always Patreon or just sharing it with your true crime obsessed friends. And remember, stay safe. Not everyone is prepared to become a parent. On November 12, 1996, a couple brought a baby into the world unprepared and unwilling to take on the role of parents. While what happened next is still a mystery, their actions would alter the course of their lives and the life of the baby forever. So if you like your coffee hot but your bones chilled, sit back and start your day with a morning cup of murder. Amy S. Grossberg and Brian C. Peterson grew up in an affluent suburb of Wyckoff, New Jersey. Surrounded by golf courses, million-dollar houses, and a short 20 miles to New York City, the pair of teens wanted for nothing. After what was described as a classic teenage courtship, the pair began a relationship while attending Ramapo High School. Amy was the creative, excelling at art and French, while Brian, the jock, was the captain of the golf team and the co-captain of the soccer team. They were the ideal match, and according to a young girl who worked alongside Amy at a gourmet food store, quote, it was probably about as serious as a teenage relationship gets. What no one knew at the time, though, was that when the pair left for college late in the summer of 1996, Amy, the good girl from a good family, was already 6 months pregnant, something she was able to conceal from everyone, including her parents, by wearing baggy clothes and avoiding her family for as long as possible once she started showing. By the time Amy hit the 9-month mark, she was enrolled at the University of Delaware, and Brian was at a college in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Just after midnight on November 12, 1996, the 18-year-old's water broke inside of her freshman dorm room. And in pain, absolutely terrified, but knowing that she couldn't go to the hospital without her parents finding out, she called her boyfriend to tell him what was going on. Brian dropped everything and drove the 3 hours to meet her at the Comfort Inn Motel, where he paid $52 and checked into room 220. What happened behind the door of that motel room has been heavily debated for decades. But what we do know is that the couple's unnamed baby boy was born on November 12th in the wee hours of the morning at 20 inches long and 6 pounds, 2 ounces. We also know that when the high school sweethearts checked out of the motel at 5 a.m., they did so without their new bundle of joy. Amy went back to her dorm, and Brian, after getting a car wash, drove back to Gettysburg. When a cleaning person came into the motel room after they checked out, she discovered blood on the sheets and immediately called the police. While they searched for the source of the blood, Amy's roommates welcomed her back. They would later tell officials how they didn't notice anything different about her, claiming she was still the same Amy they had gotten to know over the course of the last few months. However, sometime around 5 p.m. that night, Amy started complaining about stomach aches and suddenly slumped to the floor of her room. Her roommate, noticing how pale she seemed and that blood was seeping from her pants, went running down the hallway looking for help, and someone called an ambulance to the school. Taken to the Christiana Hospital in Wilmington, doctors quickly discovered that the young girl had very recently given birth and that the placenta had not passed through Amy's uterus during the delivery. Police, putting 2 and 2 together, sent canine dogs down to that motel. They were led straight to the dumpster, and inside was the body of the newborn baby wrapped up in a gray plastic bag. Amy's carefully guarded secret was now out, and both teens were brought in for questioning. Both Brian and Amy told officers that the baby was a stillborn, and that is why they disposed of him in the dumpster. However, those claims were pretty quickly dismissed when the body was brought in for autopsy, and in addition to ruling that the baby was born alive, his cause of death was determined to be from severe head fractures and shaken baby syndrome. The cause of the injuries were inconclusive, but the DA stepped in and announced his plans to charge the couple with first-degree murder and pursue the death penalty. That's when the once loving couple completely turned on one another and began pointing the finger at the other. Brian claimed that just after giving birth, Amy told him to, quote, get rid of it, while she claimed her boyfriend acted alone and put the boy in the dumpster without her. Both were indicted for the murder that December. In March of 1998, Brian Peterson pled guilty to manslaughter in exchange for his testimony against Amy. He claimed that he tried to get her to the hospital that night, and when she refused, they settled for the motel. He again claimed that he took the child's life under her command, and hearing his statement in detail, Amy agreed to a plea bargain on April 22, 1998. She admitted to unintentionally causing the death of her baby and said that neither she nor Brian planned on killing the newborn. Brian was sentenced to 2 years in prison, and Amy, held more responsible for the murder, was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Brian was released in January of 2000 after serving 20 months, and Amy was released that May after serving just 22 months. They have both since moved on in life, standing by their different versions of events that day. Neither them nor their parents, who each maintain that their child did nothing wrong, have ever visited the grave where the baby was buried. Thank you for joining me in my morning cup of murder. Please join me again tomorrow to hear a terrible thing happened on November 13th. Don't forget to rate and subscribe and let me know how you like it. If you want to help support the podcast, there's always Patreon or just sharing it with your true crime obsessed friends. And remember, stay safe. One pair of eyes can completely change the course of an investigation. A fresh look can lead to a long-awaited arrest. On November 13th, 1989, a young girl was brutally killed in a case that went cold for decades. It may have stayed that way had it not been for the officer who, taking a fresh look, finally managed to identify the killer. So if you like your coffee hot but your bones chilled, sit back and start your day with a morning cup of murder. Amy Widener was a young girl living in the south side of Indianapolis with her mother, Gloria, older brother, JP, and two younger sisters, Tanya and Cassie. Gloria, a divorcee, worked full-time to support her family, and Amy, a well-rounded and responsible girl, made things even easier. She was a good student, excelled in academics, was on the honor roll, and was very involved in clubs and other activities. She was a girl who never really found herself in any trouble, which is why it was so shocking when, at the age of just 13 or 14, she came to her mother to break the news. She was 5 months pregnant. The father of her baby was a 17-year-old friend of her brother's that she had been seeing in secret, Tony Abercrombie, and she hid her growing belly for the last handful of months with a big baggy sweatshirt. Gloria would later tell the media sources that she was completely overwhelmed by the news and wasn't sure what she was going to do to help her daughter. However, with Amy's determination and the help of her mother and her teachers, she began coming to school early every single day so she could get ahead in her studies, and made it abundantly clear that she was going to raise her baby and maintain her schooling. Jody George, Amy's French teacher, vowed to help the girl in any way she could, and commented on the teenager's strong work ethic. In October of 1987, Amy gave birth to a beautiful little girl named Emily, and after missing just 6 days of school, she was back and ready to work. Motherhood, even at her young age, seemed to suit Amy, and Jody told sources that she noticed a newfound confidence in the young girl. In between balancing her baby and school, Amy managed to find time to enjoy her life as a teenager, hung out with her friends, and even attended a Halloween party with Emily in tow. She dressed as the Jolly Green Giant, and the baby was Sprout. Gloria later picked up the baby so her daughter could enjoy the party, doing whatever she could to help Amy still enjoy her life. For the next 2 years, this was the life Amy Widener and her family lived. One filled with dogged determination, love, and acceptance. All the while enjoying watching little Emily grow and flourish. However, on November 13th, 1989, just 1 month after her daughter turned 2 years old, Amy's life and the lives of everyone who knew and loved her changed forever. On that day, Amy, not feeling well, decided to stay home from school along with her daughter. Gloria called at some point in the day to check on the girls and got no answer. Worried that something might be wrong or that Amy may have gotten sicker, she asked a neighbor to knock on the door. Still, there was no answer. Immediately, Gloria left work and drove home as fast as she could. Rushing into her daughter's bedroom, she found Amy lying sprawled across her bed, beaten and strangled to death. Emily, unharmed, was still there with her mother. Gloria later said she wasn't sure what she did first, got Emily away from the horrific scene and out of the house, or called 911. Arriving first at the scene was Captain Jack Gielker, who called the scene one that you, quote, don't forget. Amy had lacerations to her head, was unclothed, and surrounded by bloody prints. It was clear from the very beginning that this was an incredibly violent murder, one that police believed was perpetrated during a robbery gone wrong. Stereo equipment and cash were missing from the home, and from what they could piece together, it was likely that whoever did this entered through the open back door thinking the house was empty. When Amy's presence surprised him, a struggle ensued, and the young girl was beaten, raped, and strangled until she took her final breath. Left behind on the wall of her bedroom was a bloody handprint. Police cut the section out of the wall, and along with Amy's bedding, which contained trace amounts of DNA, it was all saved in hopes of identifying her killer. Unfortunately, no matter who they took samples or fingerprints from, none seemed to match the evidence. Not anyone in the family, no neighbors, and none of her or her siblings' friends. Not even Emily's father, Tony Abercrombie, who, though the pair were no longer together, appeared on the news calling Amy a, quote, great girl. There was also suspicion towards a boy named Troy Jackson, who lived behind the Widener's home, and who police claimed knew about the stolen stereo equipment. His DNA samples were not a match for what was left in Amy's room. What appeared to be a case with enough evidence to make a quick arrest turned into a decades-long cold case. While the family grieved and waited with bated breath for some sort of answer, Gloria adopted Emily and tried her best to fill the void left by the girl's mother. Then 2002 rolled around, and with it came a promising lead. 12 years after her murder, Roger Spurgeon was heading the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department's new cold case unit and got a call from someone talking about Amy's murder. This man told him that he had been having dreams about the murder, and that from this dream, he believed he knew who the suspect was. Though it may have seemed far-fetched, the case was at a complete standstill, so any new pieces of information were valuable. Unfortunately, while a lot of the caller's information lined up, almost all of it could have been gathered from media coverage. Though it was determined not to be a legitimate source, Roger knew nothing about Amy Widener's case prior to that call. His interest now piqued. He began reinvestigating the case and spoke to several of the previous witnesses. Again, things hit a dead end. In 2011, a friend of Amy's created a memorial Facebook page, and the cold case detective assigned to the murder, unfamiliar with the site, asked another officer to print out the page for him. Detective William Carter was the man that he asked. This man had never investigated a homicide before, but seeing Amy's photograph, something inside him clicked and he decided to read the case file and began working on finding her killer during his free time. Upon entering all of the information into the database, Detective Carter noticed some overlooked leads. He said that, quote, tons of friends of her brother's hadn't been spoken to or swabbed for DNA. He made it his mission to fix the oversight and began collecting DNA from all the individuals police already ruled out. That's when he landed on the name Rodney Denk, a boy who police never spoke to during the initial investigation. Detective Carter went to see Rodney where he lived with his mother and set up an appointment for several days later. When he came back, Rodney was nowhere to be found. Looking to try and rule him out as a suspect, Detective Carter checked if Rodney had an arrest history and any prints on file already. He found a battery from 1991 and larceny in 1997, which required him to provide a fingerprint. When compared to the bloody print from Amy Widener's case, it was a match. Detective Carter had just named his suspect. Now all he had to do was actually track him down. With the help of the rental car's OnStar, Rodney Denk was found, and when officers arrived, he allegedly made the statement, quote, I didn't do it, and used a knife to slash his wrists. Rodney was taken to the hospital where he confessed to murdering Amy Widener. According to his claims, he entered the house that day to steal JP's radio. Amy, hearing him in the house, came around the corner and, in his own words, Rodney, quote, hit her in the head. Detective William Carter was honored at a press conference announcing the arrest of Rodney Denk. Though the case had been cold for years, he managed to track down the killer after just 12 days of actively questioning people. In June of 2013, Rodney admitted to acting alone that day and pleaded guilty to Amy's murder. He was sentenced to 65 years in prison. Thank you for joining me in my morning cup of murder. Please join me again tomorrow to hear a terrible thing happened on November 14th. Don't forget to rate and subscribe and let me know how you like it. If you want to help support the podcast, there is always Patreon or just sharing it with your true crime obsessed friends. And remember, stay safe. You never know what could trigger someone close to the edge. On November 14th, 2017, the final day of a shooting rampage ended with a suicide. The man behind the weapon was motivated by the belief that his neighbors were up to something nefarious. So if you like your coffee hot but your bones chilled, sit back and start your day with a morning cup of murder. On November 13th, 2017, the less than 2,000 residents of Rancho Tehama, a rural unincorporated community in California, slept soundly as one of their very own pulled out a gun and began shooting. The gunman's name was Kevin Jansen Neal, and that night, he pulled the trigger and took the life of his wife, Barbara Glisson. Hiding her body underneath the floorboards, the following day, Kevin left his home and began a rampage. The first to die was a man and a woman, both neighbors with whom Kevin was in an ongoing feud over their suspected methamphetamine dealing. He then stole their pickup truck and, whilst driving down the road, began shooting at random any pedestrians or drivers who happened to cross his path. He bumped the car into a vehicle at an intersection, drove up to the driver's side door, and fired through the window at a mother and her 3 sons. The mother was shot 4 times near her heart. Though she had a license to carry, she was unable to discharge her weapon because the shooter sped off so quickly. She tried to stop 4 passing motorists to try and get some help, but all drove off without assistance. A deputy sheriff finally came by and called them an ambulance. All were injured by gunshot or flying glass, but thankfully managed to walk away with their lives. By this point, Kevin was at the Rancho Tehama Elementary School, where Sarah Lobdell, the school's secretary, heard gunfire nearby and quickly initiated a lockdown. Because of her quick thinking and the work of school custodians and teachers who jumped into action, the school gates and classrooms were locked when he arrived, forcing him to drive the truck through the gate and shoot his AR-15 type rifle at the windows and walls. One student, hiding under a classroom desk, was shot when one of the bullets actually penetrated the wall, and a 6-year-old boy was injured by a shot to the chest. A woman was shot while trying to distract Kevin and turn his attention away from the school, but even with over 100 rounds of ammunition fired at the building, none lost their lives. Surveillance footage showed the gunman shooting into the air in the field behind the school, likely in frustration at being locked out of the classrooms. According to one of his neighbors, Kevin went there that day to target the 7-year-old son of the neighbor he already killed. After fleeing the school, Kevin crashed the pickup into another vehicle and fired at the 2 occupants while they tried to flee. The female driver lost her life while her husband suffered wounds to his legs. He pleaded with Kevin to spare his life, and the gunman walked away. A passerby, unaware of the shooting, stopped his car to ask Kevin if he was okay. He was shot, wounded, and carjacked for his kindness, and another lost their life in the process. As Kevin began pursuing a victim, shooting at them from his car, police finally arrived at the scene. Ramming the stolen truck and forcing it to come to a stop, Kevin began firing at the officers and a shootout began. In the end, 44-year-old Kevin Jansen Neal took his own life with a gunshot just above his left eye. In total, the rampage lasted 25 minutes and took place at a total of 8 different crime scenes. 18 individuals were wounded and 5 lost their lives. Their names were Barbara Ann Glisson, the 38-year-old wife of the shooter, Denny Lee Elliott, 38, and his 68-year-old mother, Diana Lee Steele, Kevin's neighbors, Joseph Edward McHugh III, 56, and Michelle Iris McFadden, 55, both strangers. With just under half of the residents of Rancho Tehama living under the poverty line, the victims who were injured were left struggling to pay their medical bills. In investigating the shooting, officials found out that Kevin Jansen Neal, who attended East Carolina University but did not qualify for a degree, moved to California in 2005 and had a history of both mental illness and anger management problems. He was also a man with an obsession for conspiracy theories, and according to his mother, had been steadily declining mental health-wise since 2016. Neighbors complained to the police about him firing guns from his property, but whenever officers arrived, he would refuse to answer the door. And when speaking with some of these neighbors, one said he believed that this was Kevin's way of testing police response time and preparing for his rampage. In total, they were called to his residence 21 times from 2016 to 2017. On January 31st, 2017, he was arrested and charged with 2 felonies and 5 misdemeanors after stabbing a neighbor, Haley Poland, assaulting her mother-in-law, and stealing a mobile phone from them. He was held on a $160,000 bail, which his mother posted, and she paid about $10,000 in legal fees to secure her son's release. Once free, Kevin continued to harass his neighbors, causing them to seek a restraining order that would have required him to surrender any firearms and would prevent him from purchasing new ones. He handed over a single pistol and claimed he had no other weapons. Yet he managed to illegally manufacture the guns he used in the shooting. The day before the shooting, Kevin called his mother to say that he was, quote, fed up with the neighbors. He suspected them of making and selling meth and had previously reported them to the California Department of Forestry and Fire Prevention. He claimed the fumes from their home, from cooking the drugs, were harming his dogs. Though Danny Elliott had meth in his system at the time of his murder, and he had an arrest record involving drug paraphernalia, police found no evidence of a meth operation inside his home. Because of the restraining order, which should have left him unable to obtain weapons, and the unregistered firearms he used to commit the shooting, Kevin Neal's massacre led to domestic and international debate over the control of ghost guns as well as gun licensing laws in the U.S. Thank you for joining me in my morning cup of murder. Please join me again tomorrow to hear a terrible thing happened on November 15th. Don't forget to rate and subscribe and let me know how you like it. If you want to help support the podcast, there's always Patreon or just sharing it with your true crime obsessed friends. And remember, stay safe. Escalation can lead a dangerous person down a path that they can never come back from. On November 15th, 2011, a man was executed for the crimes he committed after a clear escalation. So if you like your coffee hot but your bones chilled, sit back and start your day with a morning cup of murder. Oba Chandler, born October 11th, 1946, was the fourth of 5 children raised by parents living in Cincinnati, Ohio. When Oba was just 10 years old, his father took his own life, and deeply impacted by the loss, the young boy jumped into his open grave as they were covering his coffin with dirt. From that moment on, Oba was a different boy. By the time he was just 14 years old, he was stealing cars and had been arrested 20 times as a juvenile. As an adult, he was charged with a long list of crimes ranging from possession of counterfeit money to loitering, burglary to kidnapping, and armed robbery, and on one occasion was accused of masturbating while looking through an unsuspecting woman's window. There was also the time that he and an accomplice broke into a couple's home and held them at gunpoint. Oba told the accomplice to tie the man up, and while he did so, he took the woman to the bedroom where he forced her to strip down to her underwear, tied her up, and then caressed her body with the barrel of his revolver. Despite his clear escalation and being described as a sexual deviant, Oba had no problem finding female companionship, and though it's not entirely clear how many times he was actually married, we do know that he fathered at least 8 children with 7 different women. This in no way stopped Oba Chandler from continuing his criminal activity. And in May of 1989, he took things a step further when he crossed paths with the Rogers family from Wilshire, Ohio. On May 26, 1989, Joanne "Joe" Rogers, 36, and her daughters, 17-year-old Michelle and 14-year-old Christy, packed up their suitcases and left their dairy farm for a vacation in Florida. This was the first time they ever left their home state, and they were excited for the mother-daughter adventure. According to the investigation, the Rogers family likely became lost on June 1st during their returning drive from Orlando back to Wilshire, and decided to take an extra day in Tampa to get their bearings back and prolong the fun. While looking for a hotel, they encountered a kind man who not only gave them directions, but offered to meet them again later and take them on a sunset cruise on the bay. Investigators believe that the stranger, later determined to be Oba Chandler, likely targeted the family after seeing their Ohio license plate, possibly even using his connection with the state as a way to lure Joe into a false sense of security. Taking him up on his offer, Joe and her teenage daughters checked into the Days Inn on Route 60 at 12:30 p.m. and were last seen at the hotel's restaurant at around 7:30 p.m. It is believed that they boarded the stranger's boat between 8:30 and 9 p.m., and that by 3 in the morning the following day, all 3 were dead. On June 4th, 1989, several people aboard a sailboat were crossing under the Sunshine Skyway when they saw something shocking floating in the water. Meanwhile, just off the pier in St. Petersburg, a similar discovery was made, and while the Coast Guard pulled the object out of the water and discovered that it was the body of a young female, they got a call to come check out a third and final victim who was found floating just 200 yards away. All 3 females were found floating face down, were bound, naked below the waist, and had a rope tied around their necks. Due to the water and the hot weather, all 3 bodies were fairly decomposed despite the short time frame, and because of this, were not identified until a week later. According to the autopsies, though, all 3 victims had water in their lungs, meaning they were thrown into the water while still alive and bound. Only Michelle, who was the second body found that day, was able to free herself from her tethers. But out in the middle of the bay, she soon drowned as well. Their state of undress indicated a likely sexual assault, and tied at the end of the rope wrapped around their necks was a concrete block to both ensure their death and, the killer hoped, make finding their bodies nearly impossible. He failed to take into account bloating, which caused the bodies to float to the surface. While investigators were trying to find the identity of the 3 bodies, Hal Rogers, Joe's husband and the girl's father, reported them missing in Ohio. Meanwhile, on June 8th, a housekeeper at the Days Inn noticed how the Rogers family room had not been disturbed and looked as though no one had slept in it. The hotel manager called the police. Fingerprints were taken from the room, and with the final confirmation from dental records, Florida police positively identified their bodies as belonging to Joe, Michelle, and Christy Rogers. Now, while the investigation continued, with marine researchers coming in and determining that the victims were thrown from a boat rather than a bridge or dry land, Oba Chandler, a killer hiding in plain sight, was working as an informant for the U.S. Customs Bureau's Tampa office. Unfortunately, due in large part to the sheer volume of tips received by police, the Rogers case went unsolved for the next 3 years. However, one of those tips involved a 24-year-old Canadian tourist who was raped in Madeira Beach just 2 weeks before the murder. Whether or not they realized it at the time, this case was integral to the Rogers case. Judy Blair said that on May 14th, she met a man who called himself either Dave Posner or Dave Posno at a convenience store in Tampa. He told Judy and her friend, Barbara Mottram, that he was in the aluminum siding business, and the following day, invited them to join him on his boat for a trip around Tampa Bay. Does this sound familiar? Judy agreed to join the stranger, but Barbara declined the offer. Once aboard, this man raped Judy Blair. She was completely at his mercy until he brought her back ashore, and she made her way back to her hotel room. A facial composite was later produced based on her description of the man. Despite how similar the attack was to the murders, police at the time assumed that Joe, Michelle, and Christy Rogers were killed by 2 men. So solid in this theory that, when the case was covered in a 1991 episode of Unsolved Mysteries, there were 2 attackers in the enactment. There was no evidence of a second man present, but once placed behind bars, Oba Chandler allegedly told his cellmate that another man was involved in the murders. The name of this supposed accomplice was never revealed. Still working the Rogers case, there was a time when Hal Rogers' brother, John, was considered a suspect. According to the sources, John raped a woman and was serving time when the murders occurred, but may have had a reason to try and arrange for the girl's murder. There were allegations against him indicating he sexually assaulted his niece, Michelle. And though there was evidence to back up the claims, the charges were dropped because of her reluctance to testify in court. Media sources claimed that John may have planned the murder during a visit to his parents' property in Tampa the month before, but none of this could ever be corroborated. He was dismissed as a suspect. Hal himself was also considered a suspect for a brief period of time, when investigators learned that he paid for his brother's bail. He claimed that this was before he found out that he abused his daughter. He also pulled $7,000 from his bank account around the time his family disappeared and was unable to account for the money. He later said that he planned on using it to search for his wife and daughters before being informed of their deaths. In 1992, police took the brochure found in Joe's abandoned vehicle and, enlarging the portion with handwriting belonging to the man who invited them on the boat ride, a billboard was posted in hopes of bringing in valuable tips. That's when they got a call from a former neighbor of Oba Chandler, and, handing over a copy of a work order the man had written for them, the two samples were matched by a handwriting expert. A palm print on the brochure was then matched to Oba Chandler, who by that point had sold his boat and left town with his family shortly after the billboards went up. Now living near Daytona Beach, Oba was officially arrested on September 24, 1992. Against the advice of his attorneys, during his trial, Oba testified in his own defense and claimed that he met Joe, Michelle, and Christy Rogers and simply gave them directions. He claimed he never saw them again, with the exception of the media coverage of the case. But in an attempt to establish his whereabouts that night, investigators found records of several ship-to-shore phone calls from his boat to his home between 1 and 5 a.m. Believing this was an attempt to explain his absence to his wife and try and provide himself an alibi, the calls indicated he was on his boat and in Tampa Bay during the estimated time of death for the Rogers family. When presented with this information, Oba claimed that he was out fishing alone that night, and that he returned so late because his engine would not start. He said that he had to call the Coast Guard and the Florida Marine Patrol before flagging down a patrol boat that was allegedly too busy to help him out. He later fixed his gas line with duct tape and returned to the shore. There were no records of these supposed distress calls, nor were there any Coast Guard patrol boats in the bay that morning. Not to mention the fact that, according to a boat mechanic who testified for the prosecution, the broken gas line wasn't a viable story, and the gasoline would have dissolved the adhesive on the tape if he'd actually fixed it that way. That's when Judy Blair was brought in to take the stand and tell the jury all about her attack and rape on May 15, 1989. Though he was not charged with the crime, her brave testimony established a pattern of attack and showed similarities between her case and that of the Rogers family. Also taking the stand was one of Oba's former employees, who said he bragged about dating 3 women the night of the murders, arriving the following morning by boat to deliver materials for the job, and immediately leaving. His own daughter, Crystal May Sue, who said that her father talked about killing 3 women and said he was afraid to return to Tampa, and a maid at the Days Inn, who said she walked by Oba Chandler on June 1st while on her way to the Rogers room for room service. Oba Chandler was found guilty of all 3 murders and sentenced to death on November 4th, 1994. He maintained his innocence and vowed to pursue any and all legal appeals. He did, however, admit to having sex with Judy Blair, but he said the incident was consensual, but that she changed her mind during the act. Because he had already been sentenced to death and unwilling to put Judy through any more emotional trauma, Oba was never tried for her rape. While awaiting his execution, Oba's wife filed for divorce, and he was no longer allowed to see his daughter. Meanwhile, investigators, who were told by a profiler that this was likely not his first murder, went to work trying to see if they could connect any other unsolved crimes to Oba Chandler. Though he became a suspect in a handful of cases at the time, he was never prosecuted for another murder. All of his appeals were later denied, and his death warrant was signed on October 10, 2011. He later told his lawyers not to file any appeals to keep him alive, though a motion was pushed through in hopes of delaying his execution on the grounds that the way Florida imposes the death penalty is unconstitutional. He did not attend the hearing, and the appeal was rejected. On November 15, 2011, Oba Chandler was executed by lethal injection. His final statement was, "You are killing an innocent man today." His many children remain divided on their father's guilt. Some believe that he is innocent. Some believe that he had help and that another man should also be prosecuted. And some believe that he is a monster who got exactly what he deserved. On February 25, 2014, investigators revealed that DNA evidence identified Oba Chandler as the perpetrator of 20-year-old Ivelisse Berrios Begayis's 1990 rape and murder. The newlywed was last seen at the Sawgrass Mills Mall where she worked, and when she did not return home that night, her husband found her abandoned car in the parking lot with slashed tires. Investigators believe that Oba Chandler purposely slashed the tires in order to offer the young woman some help, using the ruse to abduct her. Her body was found 3 hours after she was reported missing underneath a residential mailbox. Her case is now considered solved. Thank you for joining me in my morning cup of murder. Please join me again tomorrow to hear a terrible thing happened on November 16th. Don't forget to rate and subscribe and let me know how you like it. If you want to help support the podcast, there is always Patreon or just sharing it with your true crime-obsessed friends. And remember, stay safe. Many people idolize professional athletes. However, what happens when one of those heroes commits an inexplicable act of violence? On November 16, 1999, a young woman became the target of an attack orchestrated by a beloved athlete. So if you like your coffee hot but your bones chilled, sit back and start your day with a morning cup of murder. Ray Theodis Carruth, born Ray Lamar Wiggins on January 20th, 1974, spent all of his childhood in Sacramento, California. Attending Valley High School, when it came time to graduate, Ray was accepted on a football scholarship to the University of Colorado Boulder, where he played all 4 years and was named a first-team All-American in 1996. He caught a total of 135 passes for 2,540 yards and scored 11 touchdowns during his college sports career, all the while earning a degree with a double major in English. During his sophomore year at Colorado, Ray's girlfriend, Michelle Wright, gave birth to their son, Ray Jr. Michelle later had to sue Ray for child support and testified that he agreed to pay $2,700, half of what the judge ordered, on the condition that he would be a better and more present father. After finishing college, Ray became a first-round draft pick during the 1997 NFL Draft and began his professional career with the Carolina Panthers. He was the 27th overall pick and signed a $3.7 million contract with a $1.3 million signing bonus. As the Panthers' wide receiver, Ray's rookie season saw him start in 14 games, catch an impressive 44 passes for 545 yards, make 4 touchdown passes, and tied for first amongst the rookie receivers. Named the all-rookie team wide receiver, during the opening game of the 1998 season, Ray broke his foot and did not catch another pass for the rest of the season due to his injury. He played 6 seasons of the 1999 season, with 14 catches for 200 yards, in what would later be his last year playing professional football. It wasn't an injury or a cut from a team that ended his career, though. It was a cold-blooded murder that took place on November 16, 1999. That's the day that 24-year-old Cherica Adams, a real estate agent in the area, was shot 4 times with a .357 caliber revolver by nightclub manager Van Brett Watkins Sr. Just barely alive, Cherica managed to call 911 and report her attack. She also managed to point the finger at NFL player Ray Theodis Carruth, a man whom she had been casually dating and actually went to the movies with just before her attack. She claimed that Ray stopped his car right in front of her, causing her to come to a stop herself, and that another vehicle pulled up alongside her. The passenger pulled out a weapon and shot at her while Ray drove away from the scene. Despite the 4 shots fired at her, Cherica drove her BMW off the road and into the lawn of a private home and made that 911 call. She was rushed to the hospital where she quickly fell into a coma. Cherica, who was pregnant at the time, was then rushed into surgery where an emergency C-section was performed to try and save her baby. While she lay in the hospital fighting for her life, police immediately began an investigation that focused squarely on Ray Carruth. A few days later, 24-year-old Michael Eugene Kennedy was arrested, the man who allegedly drove the rented car from which the shots were fired. And on November 25th, Ray was officially arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. That same day, Van Brett Watkins was also arrested and given the same charges as Ray. Both Michael and Van had lengthy criminal records for things like drugs and violent offenses, but Ray's record was squeaky clean. On November 2nd, 19-year-old Stanley Drew Abraham was arrested, believed to be the passenger in the car that night with Michael and Van. And on December 6th, Ray Carruth was released on a $3 million bond. The condition of his release was that if either Cherica Adams or her infant died, he would have to turn himself back in. Cherica took her final breath on December 14th, 1999, and the infant, later named Chancellor Lee Adams, though survived, suffered from permanent brain damage and cerebral palsy as a result of being without oxygen for 70 minutes before being born. With that, all 4 men had charges of first-degree murder added to their list. Instead of turning himself in as promised, Ray Carruth went on the run and disappeared. But don't worry, he didn't manage to get too far. The following day, FBI agents acting on information from his mother found Ray hiding in the trunk of a car in a parking lot of a motel in Wildersville, Tennessee. Inside the confined space with him was $3,900 in cash, bottles of urine, extra clothing, candy bars, and a cell phone. On December 16th, the Panthers waived him, citing a moral clause in his contract. And on December 17th, the NFL suspended him indefinitely. While waiting for his trial, tests determined what many had already suspected, that Ray Carruth was indeed the father of Cherica's child. The prosecutors would later contend that the motive for the murder was his desperation to not become a father again, claiming he hired Van Brett Watkins to murder Cherica because she refused to have an abortion. The defense, however, said she got caught up in a drug deal gone wrong, and that on the night of the shooting, Ray refused to fund a drug deal, and Van shot Cherica in a fit of rage after she flipped him off instead of providing him with Ray's whereabouts. After 11 weeks of trial and 70 witnesses, on January 16, 2001, the jury began deliberations. 11 hours later, the foreman reported to the judge that they were split on all 4 charges. He repeated the instructions and told them to keep trying. Finally, on January 19th, the jury returned and found Ray Theodis Carruth not guilty of first-degree murder, but guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, shooting into an unoccupied vehicle, and using an instrument to destroy an unborn child. He was sentenced to 18 years and 11 months to 24 years and 4 months in prison. He was released on October 22nd, 2018, after serving just 18 years. He later moved to Pennsylvania. Van Brett Watkins Sr. was sentenced to a minimum of 40 years and 8 months and a maximum of 50 years, 8 months in prison for the murder of Cherica Adams. Thank you for joining me in my morning cup of murder. Please join me again tomorrow to hear what terrible thing happened on November 17th. Don't forget to rate and subscribe and let me know how you like it. If you want to help support the podcast, there's always Patreon, or just sharing it with your true crime obsessed friends. And remember, stay safe.